Welcome to Echoes of War. Secure your perimeter and stay with us. The mission begins now. Let's drop in. The dust in the Hindu Kush does not simply settle. It claims everything it touches, coating the lungs of the soldiers with a fine, chalky grit that tastes of ancient stone and diesel exhaust. Staff Sergeant Elias Thorne sat in the back of the jolting Humvee, his frame rattling against the cold metal as the convoy snaked through the jagged throat of the mountains. He watched the men crammed in beside him, kids like Miller and Tex, who still carried the soft expressions of the suburbs, now being ferried into a geographical nightmare. Their destination was Outpost Aegis, a location the High Command in Kabul described as a strategic observation point, though to the men on the ground, it was nothing more than a bullseye painted at the bottom of a bowl. The outpost sat in the deepest pocket of the valley, surrounded on all sides by three towering ridges known as the Three Sisters. These peaks didn't just overlook the camp. They leaned over it with a predatory weight, their granite faces scarred by caves and goat paths that offered 1,000 hidden angles for an enemy they had yet to see. Thorne felt the familiar cold knot of professional dread tightening in his gut as he looked up at the ridgelines, realizing that every step a soldier took within the wire was being logged by silent observers from above. As the convoy crested the final rocky rise, Outpost Aegis revealed itself in all its fragile glory. A chaotic cluster of HESCO barriers, sand-filled crates, and sun-bleached plywood shacks held together by grit and prayer. Captain Vance, a man whose face looked like a topographic map of the very terrain they were fighting, met them at the gate without the formality of a salute. He looked less like a commanding officer and more like a man presiding over a wake. Vance led Thorne toward the makeshift command center, passing soldiers who moved with a strange, frantic lethargy, their eyes constantly darting toward the heights. The captain explained that the locals had been ranging them for weeks, firing single shots at odd intervals not to kill, but to measure how long it took for the Americans to scramble to their fighting positions. It was a psychological meat grinder, a slow-motion siege where the enemy held all the cards and the Americans were simply waiting for the dealer to flip the first one. Thorne realized then that they weren't there to hold the valley. They were the bait in a trap that had already been set. By the time the sun dipped behind the western ridge, the valley was plunged into a premature, bruised purple darkness that brought a biting chill. Thorne walked the perimeter wire, checking the heavy machine gun nests and finding Private Miller staring through a thermal optic with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The silence of the mountain night was absolute, yet it felt heavy, vibrating with the imagined sound of 1,000 boots moving just out of sight. Thorne took the optic from the kid and scanned the center sister peak, catching a fleeting needle-thin flicker of light, perhaps a cigarette or the glint of a lens, before it vanished back into the shadows. He didn't tell Miller what he saw. Instead, he clapped the boy on the shoulder and told him to keep his eyes front. As he walked back to his cot, Thorne knew the peace was a lie. The valley was breathing, a slow and rhythmic inhale of an enemy preparing to scream, and as he lay there in the dark, he could feel the weight of the Three Sisters pressing down on the outpost, waiting for the moon to fail. The second day at Outpost Aegis brought a deceptive, suffocating heat that shimmered off the valley floor, turning the surrounding ridges into hazy, looming ghosts. Thorne spent the morning organizing a routine patrol into the nearby village of Shock Valley, a cluster of mud brick hovels that clung to the mountain's base like barnacles on a hull. The goal was civil-military cooperation, a term that felt increasingly absurd as the squad moved through the narrow, winding alleys where the air smelled of wood smoke and old resentment. Every window was a dark eye, and every elder they encountered wore a mask of polite indifference that barely concealed a deep-seated hostility. Thorne watched the way the village children went silent as the soldiers passed, retreating into the shadows of their homes. There were no men of fighting age to be found in the square, an absence that hummed louder than any warning siren. When Thorne attempted to speak with the village Malik, the old man simply pointed toward the peaks of the Three Sisters, his voice a dry rasp as he muttered about the wind bringing a storm that no umbrella could stop. It was a clear message, wrapped in the thin veil of a proverb, and Thorne felt the hairs on his neck stand up as he realized the villagers weren't just afraid of the Americans. They were terrified of what was coming down from the heights. The patrol's return to the outpost was marked by a sudden, jarring shift in the atmosphere. As they crossed the dry creek bed that served as the valley's natural artery, the silence was shattered by the rhythmic, metallic thud-thud-thud of a heavy DSHK machine gun firing from the eastern sister. The rounds didn't hit anyone, but they chewed up the dirt just inches from the lead Humvee, kicking up plumes of dust that blinded the drivers. Thorne ordered his men into a defensive posture, but the hills had already gone silent again, the muzzle flashes vanishing before the echoes had even finished bouncing off the canyon walls. This was the harassment Vance had mentioned, a tactical taunt designed to drain their nerves and force them to expend ammunition. Back inside the wire, the tension among the men was reaching a breaking point. Miller was jumping at every slammed door, and Tex was obsessively cleaning his rifle for the 10th time that hour. The psychological weight of being watched from 1,000 feet above was starting to fracture the unit's cohesion, turning the outpost into a pressure cooker where the only escape was a fight everyone knew they were losing. As night fell once more, Thorne found himself in the Tactical Operations Center, staring at a satellite feed that showed nothing but cold, unmoving rock. Captain Vance was there, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee and tracing the supply routes on a map that were now almost entirely cut off by insurgent activity. They were down to their last week of fuel, and the water shipments were being diverted due to the high risk of IEDs on the main mountain pass. The realization began to sink in that Outpost Aegis was no longer a strategic point. It was an island being slowly submerged by a rising tide of shadow. Thorne stepped out of the command shack to find the moon obscured by heavy, low-hanging clouds that turned the valley into a pit of absolute blackness. He could hear the distant, melodic sound of a flute drifting down from the ridges, a haunting, alien tune that seemed to mock their presence. It was a psychological weapon, a reminder that the enemy was comfortable in the dark, and that they were merely guests in a house that wanted them dead. Thorne gripped the cold steel of the perimeter rail, his knuckles white, knowing that the storm the Malik had mentioned was no longer a metaphor. It was a countdown. The third dawn did not bring light so much as a gray, suffocating mist that crawled over the Hesco barriers like a living shroud, dampening the sound of boots on gravel and making every man feel as though they were operating underwater. This atmospheric occlusion was the perfect cover for the enemy to close the distance, and by mid-morning, the perimeter sensors began to trip with erratic, ghostly pings that suggested movement just beyond the concertina wire. Thorne moved from post to post, finding the men in a state of hypervigilant exhaustion, their eyes bloodshot from staring into the fog for shapes that refused to solidify. The tension snapped at 1,100 hours when a single, high-velocity round punched through the plywood wall of the mess hall, narrowly missing a cook and shattering a stack of ceramic plates with a sound like a grenade. It was the signal the valley had been waiting for. Suddenly, the mist was punctured by the rhythmic strobe of muzzle flashes from the lower slopes of the western sister, and the air was filled with the terrifying, hornet-like buzz of incoming lead. The Americans returned fire, the heavy rattle of their SAW M249s cutting through the fog. But they were shooting at shadows and echoes, burning through precious ammunition against an enemy that seemed to dissolve into the rock the moment they were engaged. Captain Vance emerged from the command center, his face a mask of grim determination as he shouted orders over the din of the skirmish, trying to coordinate a mortar response to a target they couldn't see. The problem was the topography. The mortar pits were struggling to find the correct high-angled trajectory to hit the ravines where the insurgents were tucked away, and each shell that impacted the mountainside seemed only to kick up more dust and confusion. Thorne led a small fire team to the northern gate, hoping to catch a glimpse of the attackers, but they were met with a wall of fire from a second position on the eastern sister that pinned them behind a row of fuel bladders. It was a coordinated pincer movement, a sophisticated display of fire and maneuver that suggested they weren't fighting a disorganized band of locals, but a disciplined force that had spent months rehearsing this specific assault. During a brief lull in the firing, Thorne heard the distinct, metallic clack of a jammed weapon from Miller's position, and he realized with a jolt of adrenaline that the boy was frozen, staring at his rifle as if it were an alien object while the dirt around him erupted in miniature geysers of death. Thorne lunged across the open gap, sliding into the dirt beside Miller and forcefully clearing the jam before shoving the rifle back into the kid's hands with a roar that was more primal than instructional. The contact lasted for 40 minutes before the insurgents vanished back into the mist as quickly as they had appeared, leaving the outpost in a ringing, heavy silence broken only by the crackle of a burning crate. The tally was minor, 2 flesh wounds and a destroyed radio antenna, but the psychological damage was catastrophic. The seal had been broken, and the men realized that the mountains, 3 sisters, were no longer just looming landmarks, but active participants in their destruction. As the mist finally began to burn off under a searing noon sun, it revealed a horrifying sight. During the chaos of the fog, the insurgents had managed to hang a black flag from a jutting rock only 500 meters from the main gate. It fluttered in the breeze like a vulture's wing, a silent declaration that the ground they stood on no longer belonged to them, and that the true siege of Outpost Aegis had finally begun in earnest. The afternoon following the mist-covered skirmish brought a heat so oppressive it felt like a physical weight, pressing the stench of cordite and unwashed bodies deep into the fabric of the camp. Thorne stood by the north gate, his eyes fixed on the black flag draped over the rock face. It was a taunt that gnawed at the men's remaining sanity, a visual reminder that the enemy was not just close, but comfortable. Captain Vance had called a frantic briefing in the darkened, sweltering interior of the TOC, where the flickering glow of the monitors revealed a grim reality. The supply convoy expected from the lowlands had been ambushed and turned back at the Devil's Throat Pass, leaving Aegis completely isolated. They were now operating on emergency rations, and more critically, their water supply was being rationed to 1 liter per man per day in a climate that demanded 5. The soldiers' faces were beginning to hollow out, their skin turning a sallow, leathery gray as dehydration set in, making every decision sluggish and every movement a monumental effort. Thorne watched as the discipline began to fray at the edges. Arguments broke out over the shade of a HESCO barrier, and the once sharp banter of the barracks had been replaced by a low, rhythmic grumbling that sounded like the precursor to a landslide. As the sun began its slow descent, the insurgents changed their tactics from high-volume fire to a more surgical, terrifying brand of psychological warfare. A sniper, hidden somewhere in the jagged folds of the right sister, began to pick off the outpost's equipment with uncanny precision. First, it was the lens of the primary thermal camera, then the spotlight on the southern watchtower, and finally, a fuel line leading to the main generator. Each shot was punctuated by a long, agonizing silence, forcing the soldiers to remain crouched in their fighting holes, soaked in their own sweat, listening to the metallic ping of bullets finding steel. The iron noose was tightening, and the realization that they were being systematically blinded and dehydrated was more demoralizing than any direct frontal assault. Thorne moved through the trenches, distributing what little water he had left from his own canteen to the younger soldiers, his voice a gravelly whisper as he tried to maintain a semblance of order. He knew that the sniper wasn't just trying to destroy their gear. He was baiting them, waiting for someone to lose their nerve and run into the open in a desperate attempt to fix a light or a wire. The psychological breaking point arrived just before twilight when a voice began to broadcast from a loudspeaker hidden somewhere in the rocks above. It wasn't the chanting they had expected, but a recording of American pop music, distorted and warping as the batteries died, interspersed with the names of the soldiers stationed at the outpost. They had been watching the mail calls, they knew who was there. Hearing Miller's name shouted across the valley floor sent the young private into a shivering fit, his eyes rolling back as he clutched his stomach. Thorne grabbed him by the vest, pulling him down into the shadows of the bunker, and realized that the 3 sisters were no longer just mountains. They were an audience chamber where their slow demise was being performed for an invisible crowd. The night that followed was the darkest yet, lit only by the occasional flare that hissed into the sky, casting long, dancing shadows that made the rocks look like they were inching toward the wire. Thorne sat with his back against a sandbag, his rifle across his knees, feeling the noose pull tighter with every breath, knowing that by morning, the hunger for water would be eclipsed by the hunger for survival. By the 5th day, the sun had become a secondary enemy, a white-hot eye that glared down into the valley and turned the HESCO barriers into radiators that bled heat long into the night. The water crisis had shifted from a tactical concern to a visceral, agonizing reality that dominated every thought. Men were seen licking the condensation off the cooling fins of the remaining generator, or trying to chew on unflavored toothpaste just to trick their salivary glands into functioning. Thorne watched as the once disciplined soldiers began to hallucinate in the shimmering heat waves that rose from the gravel, their eyes tracking non-existent movement on the slopes, while their movements became jerky and uncoordinated. The psychological strain was compounded by the fact that the insurgents had stopped firing altogether, opting instead to sit in the high caves and watch the Americans wither under the relentless glare of the Afghan sky. This silence was more corrosive than the gunfire. It allowed the mind to wander into dark places, and Thorne had to physically intervene when Tex attempted to climb over the wire in the middle of the afternoon, convinced he saw a shimmering blue lake just beyond the first ridgeline. The command structure was beginning to liquefy under the pressure, as Captain Vance spent hours on the radio pleading with a distant headquarters that could offer nothing but empty promises of an aerial resupply that never came. The 3 sisters seemed to grow taller, their shadows stretching further across the camp each evening like fingers reaching for a throat. Thorne realized that the enemy was waiting for the exact moment when the soldiers' motor skills would fail, when the heat stroke would turn their trigger fingers into lead and their vision into a blur of salt and sweat. He instituted a buddy system where no man was allowed to be alone for more than 5 minutes, fearing that the despair would drive someone to turn their own weapon inward just to find a cold exit from the furnace of the valley. Every scrap of shade became a piece of contested territory, and the camaraderie that had defined the unit was being eaten away by the primal instinct to survive, leaving a hollowed-out group of men who looked more like ghosts than warriors. In a desperate attempt to break the cycle of lethargy, Thorne organized a nighttime water run to a small, stagnant well located 300 meters outside the northern perimeter, a mission that was essentially a suicide gambit. They moved in total darkness, stripped of their heavy body armor to move silently, their tongues swollen and their breath coming in ragged, dry gasps. As they reached the stone lip of the well, the silence of the mountain was broken not by a shot, but by a low, mocking laugh that echoed from the rocks above. A single flare ignited directly overhead, bathing the three men in a harsh, magnesium light that stripped away their cover and left them naked in the center of the valley floor. Thorne looked up and saw them, not just the shadows of the sisters, but dozens of figures standing openly on the ridgeline, silhouetted against the stars. They weren't firing because they didn't need to. They wanted the Americans to see the water, to touch it, and then to realize it had been poisoned with diesel. The realization hit Thorne like a physical blow as the smell of fuel reached his nose. The enemy wasn't just killing them, they were playing with their hope, ensuring that the thirst of the mountain would be matched only by the bitterness of their defeat. The psychological dam finally burst on the sixth morning when the heat reached a record-shattering peak, turning the interior of the metal shipping containers into literal ovens. The discovery of the poisoned well had acted as a toxic catalyst, dissolving the last remnants of the men's morale and replacing it with a twitchy, feral desperation. Captain Vance had retreated into a catatonic state inside the TOC, staring blankly at a map that no longer reflected a reality he could control, leaving Thorne as the de facto shepherd of a flock that was rapidly losing its mind. The transition from soldiers to survivors was completed when Miller, the youngest and most fragile of the group, snapped under the weight of a sensory hallucination. He began screaming that the mountains were moving, that the three sisters were closing their granite arms to crush the outpost like a soda can. Before Thorne could reach him, Miller had sprinted toward the center of the camp, firing his weapon wildly into the empty sky, his rounds thudding harmlessly into the ridges while he wailed for a mother who was 10,000 miles away. The sound of his mental collapse was a siren song for the enemy. As if waiting for this exact moment of internal fracture, the silence of the valley was detonated by a simultaneous barrage of RPGs and mortar fire that turned the outpost into a churning cauldron of fire and debris. The coordination of the attack was terrifyingly precise, targeting the ammunition dump and the medical tent within the first 30 seconds of engagement. Thorne was thrown across the gravel by the overpressure of a blast, his ears ringing with a high-pitched whine that drowned out the screams of the wounded. He crawled through the smoke, his hands stinging from the white-hot shrapnel littering the ground, and found Tex slumped over a heavy machine gun, his eyes wide and glassy as blood pooled beneath his tripod. The iron noose had finally snapped shut, and the insurgents were no longer content with potshots. Hundreds of them were pouring down the ravines of the Three Sisters, a flood of shadows and steel that moved with the terrifying fluidity of a mountain slide. The Americans were fighting from a hole, blinded by smoke and dizzy from dehydration, trying to repel an enemy that held every tactical advantage. Thorne managed to rally a handful of survivors in the remains of the North Bunker, but the situation was apocalyptic. They were low on water, nearly out of heavy ordnance, and the enemy was already breaching the outer concertina wire with bolt cutters and raw aggression. In the midst of the carnage, Thorne realized that the outpost's defenses had been designed for a war of attrition, not a total annihilation event. He looked over at Captain Vance, who had finally emerged from the command center, not with a radio or a weapon, but with a flare gun and a look of hollowed-out resignation. Vance met Thorne's eyes through the haze of burning rubber and cordite, and for a second there was a silent communication between them, the recognition that Aegis was no longer a fort, but a funeral pyre. The captain fired a red star cluster into the air, the universal signal for a position about to be overrun, and then he was cut down by a burst of fire from the ridgeline. As Thorne watched the leader of the outpost fall, something in him shifted. The fear that had been a constant companion for 6 days was replaced by a cold, crystalline rage. He grabbed a discarded belt of ammunition and draped it over his shoulder, stepping out of the collapsing bunker into a storm of lead. The breaking point had been reached, and while the outpost was falling, Thorne decided that the mountains would have to pay a blood price for every inch of dirt they reclaimed. The red flare sizzled against the blackened sky, a lonely ember that signaled the end of Outpost Aegis. Thorne stood in the center of the kill zone, the world moving in a slow, jagged blur as the adrenaline overrode the agonizing dryness in his throat. The perimeter was no longer a line. It was a porous, shattered memory where the gray-clad insurgents were now spilling over the Hesco barriers like a rising tide of ash. Thorne swung his M4 upward, the recoil thudding into his shoulder with a rhythmic, punishing comfort as he cut down two figures leaping into the mortar pit. Around him, the remnants of his squad were fighting with the ferocity of cornered animals. Tex, despite a shrapnel wound that had painted his side a deep, glistening crimson, was back on his saw, the heavy barrel glowing a dull cherry red as he chewed through belts of ammunition to keep the eastern breach from becoming a total collapse. There was no more talking, no more orders, only the visceral, guttural sounds of a struggle where the stakes were reduced to the next 5 seconds of life. The three sisters seemed to lean even closer now, the shadows of the mountains merging with the smoke from the burning fuel bladders to create an artificial night that was illuminated only by the strobing lightning of muzzle flashes and the orange roar of the dying camp. Thorne realized that if they stayed in the center, they would be swallowed whole within minutes. He gathered Miller and the three other surviving soldiers, shouting over the deafening cacophony to get them to move toward the Alamo, a reinforced concrete bunker at the northern edge that offered the only hope of a defensible bottleneck. They retreated in a fighting wedge, throwing their last remaining fragmentation grenades to create momentary windows of escape through the encroaching swarm. Miller was a different person now. The terror that had shattered him earlier had hardened into a glassy, robotic efficiency, his hands moving with a practiced speed as he swapped magazines while moving through the dirt. They reached the bunker just as an RPG slammed into the command center they had just vacated, the explosion sending a shockwave that flattened the remaining plywood shacks and sent a rain of splinters through the air. Inside the bunker, the air was thick with the smell of old grease and desperation, but the thick walls provided a momentary sanctuary from the leaden storm outside. Thorne slammed the heavy steel door shut and dropped the bar, the sound echoing with a finality that told every man in the room that this was where the story would end. The insurgents realized the Americans had consolidated, and the focus of the entire valley's fire shifted toward the bunker. The sound of thousands of rounds impacting the concrete was like being inside a giant drum, a relentless, vibrating thrum that threatened to shake their teeth loose. Through the narrow firing slits, Thorne could see the silhouettes of the enemy moving through the ruins of their home, scavenging supplies and stepping over the fallen. The outpost was gone. Only this small, concrete island remained. Thorne looked at his men, 5 shadows in the flickering light of a single emergency lantern. They were out of water, down to their last few magazines, and the radio was a twisted heap of plastic and copper. "We don't wait for them to come to us," Thorne said, his voice a low, terrifying rasp that commanded the room. "We have one push left. We break for the landing zone on the western ridge. If the birds are coming for the red flare, they'll be looking for us there. We don't die in a hole." He checked his sidearm, felt the weight of the last grenade on his vest, and looked at Miller. The boy nodded, a grim, silent warrior who had outlived his innocence. Thorne placed his hand on the door lever, the metal cold and unyielding, and prepared to lead his men into the heart of the fire for one final, desperate gambit. The heavy steel door groaned as Thorne threw the lever, the sound swallowed instantly by the roar of the mountain wind and the crackle of the inferno that had consumed Outpost Aegis. They burst out not as a retreating squad, but as a singular, desperate spearhead, sprinting through the blackened skeleton of the motor pool toward the western slope. The air was a thick soup of ash and heat that burned their throats, but the exhaustion that had plagued them for days was gone, replaced by the cold, electric clarity of the end. Thorne led the way, his rifle barking at the shadows that darted between the burning ruins, while Miller and the others laid down a continuous, overlapping curtain of fire that kept the primary swarm at bay. They weren't just fighting men anymore. They were fighting the terrain itself, scrambling over jagged rocks and through tanglements of concertina wire that tore at their uniforms and flesh. As they hit the base of the western ridge, the first bird appeared, alone a H-64 Apache, a dark, predatory shape screaming across the three sisters, its 30 chain gun stitching a line of fire along the ridgeline to suppress the insurgents. It was a beautiful, terrifying sight, the mechanical roar of the engines sounding like a vengeful god descended into the valley. The climb was a vertical nightmare of loose shale and vertical drops, with bullets snapping against the stone around them like whips. One by one, the shadows of the valley tried to pull them back down, but Thorne's team moved with a feral synchronization, covering each other's movements until they reached a flat plateau designated as the emergency extraction point. The Apache circled above, raining hellfire onto the slopes below to keep the paths clear, while a pair of Black Hawks flared their rotors, kicking up a blinding cyclone of dust as they touched down on the rocky ledge. Thorne shoved Miller and the remaining 3 into the bay of the first bird, the crew chief screaming over the turbine whine to get them inside. Thorne turned back for one last look at the fishbowl. From this height, Outpost Aegis looked like a dying star, a bright orange wound in the dark skin of the mountain. He saw the figures of the enemy swarming the ruins, but they looked small now, insignificant against the vast, indifferent scale of the Hindu Kush. He realized then that the mountain didn't care who won. It only cared who was left to be buried in its dust. As the Black Hawk pulled pitch and banked hard away from the valley, Thorne sat on the vibrating floor, his back against the cold aluminum. He looked at his men, hollow-eyed, blood-streaked, and shivering despite the heat, and saw the ghosts they had become. They had survived the three sisters, but the valley had taken a piece of them that no medal or homecoming could ever replace. The silence inside the cabin, save for the rhythmic thrum of the rotors, was the first true peace he had known in months, yet it felt heavy with the weight of those they had left behind in the dirt of Aegis. Below them, the rugged landscape of Afghanistan began to blur into a sea of dark, jagged waves, the outpost fading into a tiny, flickering ember before finally vanishing into the shadows of the peaks. Thorne closed his eyes, the taste of limestone still lingering on his tongue, knowing that while they were leaving the valley would never truly leave them. They were the ghosts of the outpost, bound forever to a patch of ground that the world would soon forget, but which they would carry in their marrow until the end of their days.